Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and a big, huge, warm welcome back to all of you that have tuned in for today's Kev Baker Show right here on Truth Frequency Radio, www.tfrlive.com. Now, today's show is going to be something very, very special indeed, because this is something that I have been excited about before I even knew it was going to happen. And that's because I'd heard today's guest speaking on one of my favourite shows not so long ago, over on Ground Zero with Clyde Lewis. And then out of the blue, much to my surprise, delight, should I say, I was contacted by the producer of Ground Zero, my good friend Ron Patton, and he has worked his magic, and here we are today. But before we get into that, let me just remind you that tomorrow, coming up on the show, we have got Ryan Gable. He is going to be coming on. We're going to be talking about the movie Bird Box, the D-Wave quantum computer, all the good stuff right here tomorrow on KBS at the same time, same place. But I really want to waste no time today, because today's guest is somebody I know you are going to love. He covers a lot of the topics that we have spoke about here on the show before. And today's information is not going to be very eye-opening. Not only going to be very eye-opening and very revealing as to the extent and the lengths that the CIA and other intelligence agencies have gone to literally hijack the music industry, the counter-culture movements, but it's also the kind of show that you can take to your friends, because this deals with a lot of household names, and some of the topics that we cover here on the Kev Baker Show, they might not be the perfect introduction for people who are new to this kind of information. But when you can throw in names like John Lennon, Tupac, Janis Joplin, Timothy Leary and the LSD movement and all that stuff that people can relate to, it goes a very long way to opening their eyes to the bigger picture as well. So without any further ado, let me introduce to you today's guest. And today's guest is John Potash. And John Potash has been featured on C-SPAN's American History TV, A&E, The Reels Channel, The Real News Network, and Russia Today television networks. Now, he's also been featured on hundreds of radio programs in the US, England, and all the way down to New Zealand. And I know we've got listeners down in New Zealand, so a big welcome to all of you. And he's also been on, wait for it, Coast to Coast AM. Now, he's published articles in Z Magazine, Covert Action Quarterly, the Baltimore Chronicle, Rock Creek Free Press, and the Free Press, and he has worked counselling people with mental health problems and addictions for over 25 years. Now, back in May 2015, Potash released the book Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA's murderous targeting of SDS, Panthers, Hendrix, Lennon, Cobain, Tupac, and other activists. Now, Potash completed a graduate studies at Columbia University, and he published his first book, The FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders, in 2007. Today I watched the documentary version of Drugs as a Weapon Against Us, and he's here with us live right now on KBS tonight. So, John, a big, huge, warm welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me on, Kev.
No, like I said in opening there, this is the kind of subject matter that can really open people's eyes to the bigger picture in the world. And a lot of these household names, people kind of their jaws drop when they hear this for the first time. I've spoke about Laurel Canyon on the show before. I know that you've touched on that. But to start with, I have to ask you, how did you fall into this? What really prompted you to do this magnificent piece of work?
Well, thanks a lot. I'm glad you liked the film. I was working as a drug and alcohol counselor right out of college, starting in 1989, and I was doing a lot of political and social activism around Baltimore, where I was working. And so I started hearing lots of stories from my clients about the government really selling drugs. And then I saw a lot of corruption in Baltimore. And then when I was involved in political activism, such as anti-war activism, blocking a street during the 1991 Gulf War under Bush 1, somebody from the Christic Institute gave me the Kerry report, which outlined the CIA's cocaine trafficking during the Iran-Contra crack situation that you probably have heard about, with Gary Webb exposing it as the first viral article. But this was in '91, so I heard about that and started exploring and doing a lot of research on other drugs, such as I had a drug abuse problem in high school that I weaned away from in college, thank God. But after trying LSD, acid about half dozen times and trying many other drugs, I was lucky to get away from them all. But before I did, I realized that they were causing problems. And so I was a little bit in denial of those problems because I associated with drugs with the 60s activism and thought it was all good. So I bought into all the propaganda of the CIA at that time. It took me years, though, to slowly realize that the CIA was the biggest LSD trafficker and drug trafficker in general in the world. And so I slowly came upon more and more evidence of that, and then compiled it in this book and then, of course, the film.
And, of course, you take us all the way back in the movie. And the British, they have definitely got a major part to play in the early days, in the early part of your actual documentary, and the fact that they were very big into the opium trade. And you examine that and you take it further, because then you show how the money from that basically was used to set up the Ivy League schooling system over in the US.
Yeah. And I have a video of James Bradley talking about this, and he had written the book Flags of Our Fathers that was made into a Clint Eastwood movie. He's a New York Times bestselling author. And then after that book, he wrote the book Imperial Cruise, which outlined all the families that were involved in the opium trade. And he outlines how, for example, the Russell family was the largest opium shippers, and they were working the most with the British East India Company back in the 1700s. And they founded Yale University. And then the Russell Trust was used to endow the secret club, Skull and Bones, at Yale. And the same was done, for example, by the Cabots, the opium traders who started Harvard University and started the Porcelain Club, which is the Skull and Bones version of the club at Harvard, and the Greens with Princeton, and the Lows with opium traders who started Columbia University and Low Library, the main administrative buildings named after. And so that just shows the way they transferred this money and power into selected people, selected families, such as the Rockefellers, who graduated from Yale. The Rockefellers also were in Skull and Bones, and the John Pierpont Morgan family. The Pierponts were intermarried with the Russells, and I show the evidence of that. And so they all got their start from this opium money, and show how the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts and all of these robber barons are actually interconnected. And they then built up their fortunes and connections with the Ivy League schools, but then show how they started the CIA to really gain a group, an intelligence arm, and it's pretty much like their own army that was by the National Security Act of 1947, made themselves above the law. And so I show how that played out.
No, absolutely. And I'm just sitting listening to you. I've taken about 5 pages of notes today. I was absolutely enthralled with everything I was watching. And of course, a lot of the time on shows like this, we hear about JFK. Now, there's so many different angles that you can approach the JFK assassination from, but I really got my eyes open today when I was listening to how he was basically planning on pulling out of Vietnam. And of course, Vietnam, one of the most opium-rich areas of the world.
Yes. Yeah, so I show there was, researchers have come up with many reasons why the CIA assassinated JFK, and basically, along with the oligarchs and, military intelligence, assassinated JFK, John F. Kennedy. And but I just highlight the reasons of him attacking the mafia that were helping the CIA deal the drugs on the streets and helping the trafficking of a lot of these drugs. But JFK also tried to close up Project MKUltra, which was a huge umbrella project that the CIA had started in 1953, which had 199 sub-projects, And the documents of MKUltra showed it was the use of drugs for unconventional warfare, with testing about 36 different drugs to use as unconventional warfare. LSD being the top drug, but of course also cocaine, heroin, ecstasy, all kinds of speed, super psychedelics like BZ and STP, etc. But the use, and when they say unconventional warfare, people think of battlefields and foreign lands, but I show all the evidence that the battlefield really was members of the U.S. and British and other, Western countries that were protesting the wars, the perpetual wars in our country, and protesting for civil rights. And so I show the U.S. Senate Church Committee how they investigated the MK, Project MKUltra. And in their report, they say that LSD was used when people at all social levels of the U.S. society. And this report came out in the mid-'70s and said, it was often used surreptitiously, meaning they were dosed without them realizing it at first, and then they didn't know what was happening when they were tripping. But so that's some of the ways that these drugs were used. And so I, of course, go into how they were particularly used to manipulate musicians to promote drugs. But then when these musicians started sobering up and getting more into anti-war and anti-racist activism, they were done away with.
Yeah, absolutely. That seems to be the fatal, I use that word knowingly, the fatal move that a lot of these artists seem to make. And I'm sure a lot of the audience will be well versed in the character Timothy Leary.
Yeah.
And of course, we see.
Right. And Kev, I just wanted to actually add the fact that, and, as you said, it just shows that, I show the clips in my film that John F. Kennedy was clearly pulling out of Vietnam where the top opium fields were. And that was what the Vietnam War was about, was control of those opium fields. All the best evidence shows. And because I have, of course, CIA whistleblowers saying, and people like Judy Woodruff of, PBS now, people know her. But for then, she was doing a report on Frontline where she showed CIA documents saying that the CIA was trafficking heroin from Vietnam into the United States. So that's, the real reason for the Vietnam War, and why Kennedy, another major reason Kennedy was assassinated was because he was pulling out of the Vietnam War.
Absolutely. And, we can fast forward even to modern day to see that things haven't changed, because Afghanistan, the Taliban pretty much had a handle on the opium trade there. You were looking at very little output. And then we have the invasion, we have the war, and people would normally think, well, no drugs are going to be coming out of there now. We've got a hold of that place. But in fact, an inversion happened, because about 95% of the world's opium then was supplied by Afghanistan. So we can see that there's a historical kind of route here. It seems to be the game that the CIA play, and it seems to be really an important factor in a lot of the wars that we fought.
No doubt. I mean, it's definitely no coincidence that the two longest wars in American history are Vietnam War and Afghanistan War, which happen to be the places for the locations of the two largest supplies, the best supplies of poppy fields, which produce opium and heroin, called the Golden Triangle and the Golden Crescent for producing heroin, two ends of the same mountain range.
No, absolutely. Now, we're probably going to be all over the place in this first segment, John, because that's the way my head works, because I'm just fresh from looking at all of this information. But, we've got Timothy Leary, who obviously most of us will have heard of. He's featured on Netflix documentaries. Everyone's heard that story. But a new name on me today was somebody called Ken Kesey. Can you explain his role in all of this as well? Because he's a similar character, maybe not as well known as Timothy Leary.
Well, so I think talking a little bit more about Leary will help understand Kesey better. Leary basically said he had gotten, there was something called the Human Ecology Fund, which was found by Anthropology Today and a number of other places in the MKUltra documents to be a CIA front company for giving out money for projects that involved testing psychedelics on students at about 45 different colleges around the country, on prisoners, and on hospital patients around the country, and so Leary's doing that. He's giving, testing psychedelics on students, first mushrooms and acid on Harvard students. And he's kicked out of Harvard. And someone takes him under his wing, the Mellon Hitchcock family, with Peggy and William Mellon Hitchcock give Leary loads of money to open psychedelic centers all over, in a number of places, maybe half dozen to a dozen places around the United States and Mexico. And so they also give him their William Mellon Hitchcock's mansion on a 3,000-acre estate just an hour north of New York. And so the Mellon Hitchcock family was the owners of Gulf Oil and Mellon Bank. They're one of the richest families in the world. And they also held various U.S. intelligence posts at different times. So I argue that this is just an extension of CIA's MKUltra, Project MKUltra, because once Leary has that mansion an hour north of New York, he holds constant parties in that mansion and lures loads of influential people up from New York City to a constant party in the mansion. And this is what was the hotbed for activists, young activists going on freedom rides down south to support the Martin Luther King Freedom Summer campaign, to register blacks to vote and to fight for civil rights down south. And so I argue that was definitely used against them. And so they get all these young influential artists, writers, and activists from New York up into this mansion party, and there are loads of MKUltra scientists hanging out there and testing different psychedelics on all these influential artists, getting them to promote these psychedelics, but also hurting their minds. And so then you get to Ken Kesey on the West Coast. This was on the East Coast in New York. On the West Coast in San Francisco, in the San Francisco Bay Area, you had Ken Kesey. He was a graduate student at Stanford University in the writing program, and he was not using drugs at that time. He was actually an alternate on the Olympic wrestling team, and but he needed money, and so they're offering money to him at Stanford University Hospital to try LSD. And so he accepts what's the equivalent of about $150 to try the LSD. And so they do that experiment with him, and then they give him a job at the hospital, and they give him keys to the LSD supply. And he goes and steals a lot of the LSD and holds constant parties at his home in that area, and starts promoting LSD that way. And so people start surrounding him that are just fresh out of the military, who call themselves the Merry Pranksters. And they influence him to paint a bus in psychedelic colors around 1964, and to drive it across the country and all through the civil rights South, and to promote LSD to all these civil rights activists and down south, and all these black neighborhoods down south. Then they come up north to New York City, which was their real destination, and they drive it through Harlem right after the race riots there, which are also called by activists race rebellions. And I'm sorry about that phone call. Let me try to turn that off any way I can. Okay. Don't even know how to, but I'm going to see what I can do.
It's just the CIA, John. Don't worry about it.
Well, I turned it off, so hopefully it's not going to call back. But anyway, so you got at that point, you got them promoting, acid to these different areas. Then they drive their bus back, and they start what's called the acid tests. And the acid tests got bigger and bigger. But these military folks that, people fresh out of the military that surrounded Ken Kesey were doing major promotion of LSD all over the area. And Kesey, after about the second acid test, said he didn't like it anymore, and he wanted to stop the acid test, and he wanted to tell people to graduate from acid, to stop doing acid. But the military folks that surrounded him said no, and police coincidentally arrested Kesey just after that pronouncement, and these military folks keep it going. And so at those acid tests, and at what became bigger and bigger acid tests, the TRIPS Festival, and then the Human Beings, which increased from hundreds of people at the first acid test to thousands of people at the TRIPS Festival to about 10,000 at the Human Being, there was a MKUltra scientist named John Gittinger. He was the top psychologist in the CIA Project MKUltra program. And he said him and two other CIA scientists actually were flying out regularly to San Francisco to be part of those acid tests. And then there was two other members of MKUltra that were also at the TRIPS Festival with him. And so it just shows that these acid tests were using people as guinea pigs and trying to promote, LSD to all these activists in the San Francisco Bay Area and in the New York area. And it was what they call an astroturf campaign. That's in public relations terminology. That's a fake grassroots campaign to promote acid as this underground phenomenon when it's really sponsored by the CIA covertly.
And of course, you've got the anti-war movement that's ongoing at the time as well, and the use of the LSD, the input of LSD into that. I mean, that kind of really distracted any movement that was getting going there, and the war continued after JFK, right?
Right. So it was diverting all these civil rights activists to these acid parties, and they said in their own documents that LSD can be used to get people, de-radicalize people basically, and divert them away from politics. And what William S. Burroughs says is actually make them less competent, so they can't do their activism as well. And so it started having effect on the largest anti-war group of that time. The Students for Democratic Society by 1969 was 100,000 strong, and arguably the largest anti-war group or student group for sure in the United States history. And so they were targeting them in a big way. And that's why for example, in 1965, Robert Lashbrook, the deputy director of MK Ultra, according to Ernest Hemingway's longtime editor, A.E. Hotchner, he wrote the book Blown Away about the Rolling Stones. And in that book, he said Lashbrook, deputy director of MK Ultra, came over to London in early '65 and brought over tons of acid, tons of agents, and tons of money. And he ordered the agents to put the LSD in as many musicians' hands as possible. And within a few months, George Harrison's dentist invites George Harrison and John Lennon over for dinner and then doses their coffee. And so John Lennon was furious that he was involuntarily given LSD. And George Harrison said he didn't even know what it was at the time. And so I showed the evidence that, agents all around them then next time within the year convinced them to try it again. And they thought, okay, well, maybe it's not so bad after all, LSD. And so they were manipulated to then promote LSD in their albums, such as Magical Mystery Tour, which was basically a takeoff on the psychedelic bus that Kesey and the Pranksters had taken across the country. I think people have said that the Who's Magic Bus was a similar ode to that bus, that psychedelic bus. But so that's how they got manipulated these musicians to promote the LSD and promote acid to the activists to divert them from their best work. And so then 2 years later, in '67, Mick Jagger took his first hit of LSD after being influenced to do so by a guy named David Schneiderman, who the Daily Mail said was undercover FBI and MI5, which of course is British FBI. So that was, of course, another extension of MK Ultra and some of how this worked.
And of course, MK Ultra, it may have apparently, or on the face of it, finished. But as with all these other government projects and programs, it just changed name, right? And I think it's called MK Search after that. And then something else we're going to get into after the break, I hope, is something called MH Chaos. Because that was the first time I'd ever heard of MH Chaos when you were speaking with Clyde Lewis. Absolutely new to me. I've seen it in the documentary as well. So I'm really keen to get into all of that. And before we go to the break, John, let me give you an opportunity to tell people where they can find your work, where they can watch the DVD, etc. Over to you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, you can find out more about the movie at drugsasweaponsmovie.com. You can find out more about the books and the movie at drugsasweapons.com. But it's basically the books and movies are being sold on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. The movies being sold at Best Buy, Target, Walmart. And you can rent it on iTunes. You can rent it on Google Play, on Vimeo, on places like Microsoft Xbox, on YouTube Rent, and a number of places like that.
Absolutely fantastic. And folks, I've watched this. I urge you all to go and check it out. And that is Drugs as a Weapon Against Us. Now, we'll be getting into a lot more of this after the break. Really keen to find out what role MI6, MI5 played in all of this as well, because You know, it's very quick. We're all very quick to blame the CIA, but they were just one of many alphabet agencies that was really helping to steer a population. Social engineering. We'll be back after the break.
This is the Kev Baker Show.
Okay, we're back. We're live, and our very special guest today is John Potash, and he is the man behind the book Drugs as a Weapon Against Us. And of course, that has now been made into a documentary film as well, something that I thoroughly enjoyed today. And we're going to jump right back into it, because one of the most interesting subject matters I've ever come across before I was a radio host, before I'd done YouTube, and even now up until today, has to be Laurel Canyon. Now, I remember first telling my mum about Laurel Canyon, and she was shocked that some of her favourite music stars all being connected to this one quite creepy little place. But, John, I want to ask you on your take about Laurel Canyon. And, of course, we have to give credit here to Dave McGowan for his work and kind of exposing a lot of this stuff as well. So what is it with Laurel Canyon?
Yeah, well, I'm so glad to have Dave McGowan, you know, at least a small clip of him in the film and to highlight his work, because I think he's a great writer, researcher that I was communicating with when I first came out with my book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. And then within a few days of me communicating back and forth and comparing notes with him about publishing and research, he gets diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And someone had warned him several months before that people that talk about the things he's talking about might find themselves with stage 4 cancer suddenly. So he died within maybe 4 or 5 months of that. And it was very, very sad for me. But Laurel Canyon, he exposed the fact that there was dozens and dozens of our really, you know, the top musicians, you know, according to popularity, all had gravitated from all over the country into this one little section of Los Angeles, Laurel Canyon. And it just so happened, and I don't think it's a coincidence, that in that little neighborhood of Los Angeles was also Air Force, the Air Force's giant movie studio called Lookout Mountain Studio, the film laboratory. And Lookout Mountain had produced about 19,000 classified films, and it had signed many of the top directors and movie actors and producers to confidentiality agreements about all the films they worked on at Lookout Mountain. And so it could have been, you know, any number of the top films in our, you know, over the years could have been produced there without our knowledge. And so, you know, I argue, of course, that was for military propaganda reasons and the oligarchs' propaganda reasons. So all of a sudden, here comes all these top musicians, you know, these musicians who actually weren't known at all at the time. They gravitate to this one scene and they become instant stars. And I show how, you know, they were kind of cultivated to be instant stars. But of course, Dave McGowan gets much more into it. But virtually all of them came from either military families and were in the military themselves first, or from the wealthiest families in the country. For example, David Crosby came from a family that was heavily involved in the military, but also was the Van Cortlandt family, which a major highway in New York City is named after. You know, an extremely wealthy family. And a guy named John Phillips came straight out of the military, and his father was military, and he was had a very bizarre life when he formed the Mamas and the Papas and manipulated the rest of the band to take tons of LSD and really promote LSD behind the scenes. And Frank Zappa he went to school in a chemical warfare area of my area of Baltimore, Maryland. And his father was a chemical warfare scientist. And so these were some of the people that ran these huge drug and sex parties in Laurel Canyon. Now, I argue that Zappa later in life turned on his, you know, grooming and family. And Jim Morrison, whose father was captain the ship that started the Gulf of Tonkin incident that started the Vietnam War, And I show a picture of him, of course, with his father. He's all clean cut at that time as a teenager. But and he, I think, turned on his family too. But he didn't have space to get into all that of the changes of all these musicians. But at the time, they were promoting drugs like crazy. They were having drugs and sex parties, and that's how I argue one of the ways that they got when John Lennon and the rest of the Beatles visited the United States and were at a party with David Crosby and some of these actors that were working with Lookout Mountain Air Force's Lookout Mountain Film Studio. Were at a party, how they were influenced to try, LSD again. And that's where I have Lennon on film talking about that. And George Harrison, of course, tried LSD a second time with Lennon there. And they influenced Ringo Starr to start try LSD for the first time. And so that's some of the way they popularized, these drugs and popularized the whole hippie culture that way. And so the Manson family was a regular part of the Laurel Canyon party scene also. And so that's some of the stuff that was going on there.
And of course, I think the whole Sharon Tate event, that took place in Laurel Canyon as well, didn't it?
Yes. And so there was loads of murders in Laurel Canyon and loads of covert operations going on there, no doubt. Yes.
No, absolutely. Now, you mentioned John Lennon there. I'll definitely want to come back to him from the British perspective. But another character, Jimi Hendrix. And when I was looking at your information today, it was news to me that, in fact, his manager may have had links to our very own MI6 over here.
Yes, because of the racism in the United States, Jimi Hendrix, of course, was such a brilliant guitarist, but couldn't make it big in the United States at first. So he goes over to England. He's instantly beloved by all the British musicians who thought he was a brilliant guitarist. And he was being booked all over the place, all over Britain, but he couldn't handle all of the booking and the instant stardom. And so a guy named Mike Jeffries inserted himself into Jimi Hendrix's life and career and said, I can handle all your booking and handle all of this for you. And so Jimi Hendrix at first accepted him. And but Hendrix had written Are You Experienced, arguably his best album, before using loads of drugs. Contrary to what people think. And this is according to really the top biography on Hendrix. So he's one of them, saved by Cesar and Glebic. And so, but Jeffrey starts to manipulate Hendrix a bit. So he Hendrix is instantly a star, and then he comes into United States and becomes big in the United States also. But Jeffrey starts booking his concerts. Like he'll book one in New York City on a Friday night, and then on Saturday night he'd book him in L.A., and then on Sunday night he'd book him back in on the East Coast again, somewhere like Washington. So he was really wearing Hendrix out, and I argue on purpose, because he would also do things such as plant drugs on him in airports, according to Jimi Hendrix's fiancée, Monica Danneman, who said Hendrix believed that Jeffries did that and got him arrested. So to have him more under authority's thumb and Jeffries' thumb. And he further, when Hendrix tried to do political benefits, such as anti-war benefits, and Hendrix was already getting away from any LSD use anymore and getting away from any other hard drug use and just smoking weed every now and then, drinking a little bit, Jeffrey doses his drink before the show with a load of heavy-duty LSD, and it hurt his guitar playing. He was really upset about it, according to Monica Danneman's memoir about Hendrix's. And so Hendrix also said that Jeffries regularly tried to ban him from doing anti-war benefits, and even had mafia kidnap him and supposedly brought in bigger mafia to free him. And so all the evidence. So Jeffries admitted he had worked for MI6 before he entered Jimi Hendrix's life. But all the evidence shows that he actually continued to work for MI6. And so within 48 hours, and for Americans, MI6 is British CIA. But so within 48, so then later in Hendrix's life, he just couldn't take it anymore. He kept trying to get out of his contract with Jeffries, but had a hard time doing it. And finally, he fired Mike Jeffries. And within 48 hours of Hendrix firing Mike Jeffries, Hendrix is dead. And so two people said that when Mike Jeffries was drunk, he admitted having Hendrix killed. And so who can do that, pull something like that off within 48 hours? except someone connected to, of course, British intelligence or U.S. intelligence.
That truly is amazing. And of course, while we're dealing with the Brit side of things, I have to get to John Lennon, because obviously one of the most recognisable names and faces over here in the UK and around the world. And of course, he shot to fame with the Beatles. And there's a case to be made that they were a product of our Fabian Society, a tool of social engineering brought to the US for exactly that purpose. So what's your take on the Beatles and, more importantly, John Lennon and his demise?
Yeah, I didn't get into that Fabian Society manipulation in that way, and so social engineering, though I can believe it. I just, there's just limits to how much I can write and say in my books and films with, but, it's clear from what I said earlier about, MK Ultra coming to London, but also Michael Hollingshead, who was a British, propaganda agent, they called him. He actually is the one that got Timothy Leary tripping for the first time, and he gave him a dose of LSD that had him tripping for 3 straight days. It's like a mega dose of LSD, which Leary's associate said turned his mind to mush, temporarily, and he became Hollingshead's lapdog. That's how they described it. So Michael Hollingshead was a high-level player who then also had ships off the coast of Britain that had pirate radio that got the first rock and roll played in England when BBC was banning it. So he brought loads of LSD himself over to England and started the Psychedelic Center in London. And he was pretending like he was just doing it for the good of everybody and trying to turn on the world to LSD as if he was, such a do-gooder. But it was obvious that he was just the Tavistock and MI6 version of the CIA's MK Ultra, and so certain biographies said that the George Harrison's dentist who gave LSD first to Harrison and Lennon by dosing their drinks, their coffees, got that LSD from Hollingshead. So yes, obviously Tavistock and MI6 were involved, but so Lennon's manipulated to promote drugs, and he also develops a heroin problem. But then by about 1969, he talks to Marshall McLuhan, famous professor in Canada, who convinces him that he was duped, and he called him a useful fool for U.S. and British intelligence in promoting drugs. Now, I don't get into this in detail in my book because I kind of found this out a little bit after coming out with my book. But nonetheless, obviously, Lennon started, he got away from heroin. He tried to get away from LSD. He said he thought he was losing his mind on LSD. He had so many bad trips. He actually considered trepanning, which is drilling a hole in your skull to supposedly expand your consciousness, which is obviously crazy.
Never a good idea, John. Never a good idea.
No. And he was having such bad anxiety before his concerts that he was throwing up regularly. So that's also what LSD can do to you, is it can hurt your emotional control. So obviously, he got away from a lot of the drugs and started just focusing on raising his son, his 5-year-old son. And then when he came back out with 2 new albums in '79 and '80. And he announced he was going to lead a Teamsters strike in San Francisco, and he was just a few months away from getting his American citizenship. Then he's murdered, and so a lawyer named Fenton Bressler, a British barrister they call him, a British lawyer and crime reporter, Fenton Bressler for one of the daily newspapers, did a 7-year study and came out with the fact that the CIA had used hypnosis and drugs to manipulate Mark David Chapman into becoming a shooter of John Lennon. But I also show how a real good music writer named Phil Strongman wrote a real good book on John Lennon also, and he comes out with the fact that Jose Sanjanis Perdomo, who was the doorman that night at the Dakota, John Lennon's apartment building, was actually a CIA hitman. And
now this is what really got me today watching this, because he's got ties to Watergate as well, I believe, right?
Yes, he was part of the Bay of Pigs, and he's well known in Cuba as part of the CIA. And so this guy gets to be doorman at the Dakota, and obviously aids Mark David Chapman in the assassination, or murder or assassination, whatever you want to call it, of John Lennon that night.
So you see John Lennon starting to wake up, for lack of a better term, about to lead a march, get his American citizenship, and also we go on to find out that the FBI had been keeping files on John Lennon as well, surveilling him for years, right?
Yes. Yeah, and he said in the early 70s, he says, if anything happens to me, it's not just a coincidence, because they're following me all the time. Intelligence agents are following me all the time. They've got my phone bugged. They're doing all kinds of things to me, so that you're not even hiding it. They're making it obvious. And so he was in constant battle with the U.S. intelligence that way, and probably British intelligence too. So yeah, I mean, so the bullets that Mark David Chapman got were from a Atlanta police officer who also taught Mark David Chapman how to become an expert shooter. And so I show the evidence that CIA has trained police intelligence to do their bidding.
Yeah, we've been looking at released CIA documents and some of the experiments they've been running as well. And just the other week, we were learning how some of their subjects were able to actually shoot a target from hundreds of meters away, blindfolded, while under forms of mind control. So it just shows how all the kind of shows we've been doing on here lately, they've been kind of building up to this, really. And again, I want to thank you publicly for your time today, because you've put all of this together. You're doing heaps of these interviews right now, and you've taken time out to come and speak to us, and I'm dragging you here, there, and everywhere. So a big thank you, and I really do appreciate that. So we've got John Lennon, we've got him, and another character who jumped out at me that you talk about at length, Tupac Shakur. Now, there's a lot of documentaries been made on him. Quite a good one on Netflix not long ago. Myself and my partner, we really enjoyed that. But Tupac, talk to us about Tupac, because this is still a controversial character to this day.
Yeah, so when I focus on the MK Ultra targeting activists, I focused on the Students for Democratic Society and the Black Panthers. And so they used LSD to, for example, one of the top groups of Students for Democratic Society were at Columbia University. They led the first building takeovers that sparked building takeovers all over the country at different colleges around the U.S. And so Columbia SDS had said that they were anti-LSD. They thought it was anti-revolutionary. And then undercover agents spiked their punch at a party and got them tripping, and manipulated them to promote LSD after that. And so the other group, the Black Panthers, were heavily targeted, both by what you had said before, MH Chaos and MK Ultra, I argue, along with the FBI's Counterintelligence program, which activists broke into an FBI office and stole thousands of documents of the FBI's that revealed the FBI's Counterintelligence program. And so I have FBI whistleblowers and CIA whistleblowers in my film talking about these different operations and what happened. And so Tupac Shakur's mother was Afeni Shakur, and she was a one-time leader of the Harlem Black Panthers. And I show how her and the founder one of the founders of the Black Panthers nationally, Huey Newton, were targeted by undercover agents to start using cocaine, and develop problems with them in their life with this cocaine use. And so then Afeni Shakur marries. She was originally married to Lumumba Shakur, who was the founder of the Harlem Black Panthers. She ends up coupling with Lumumba and her divorced, but she ends up coupling with Lumumba's adopted brother Mutulu Shakur, who was a co-founder of a group called the Republic of New Africa. Mutulu was an acupuncturist who was doing incredible work at helping addicts in the Bronx with addictions problems, and so Tupac grew up in this family of incredible left-wing activists, and Afeni Shakur called Tupac her Black Prince of the Revolution, because that was the kind of way they talked at the time about the revolution. But Tupac, by the age of 17 years old, headed the New African Panthers, which was a group that was active in 8 to 10 cities around the country, attempting to replicate the Black Panthers in about 1990. And so Tupac was already a black national leader, and that was one of the biggest targets of the FBI's counterintelligence program, were black, activist leaders. And the FBI COINTELPRO whistleblowers said that COINTELPRO continued. It was supposed to be officially ended in 1971. It continued under different names.
Somebody try to call you, I think, John. You see, you're a man in demand, and of course...
Sorry about
no,
that.
No, that's okay. All the way through the 80s, of course, you've got the cocaine that is absolutely flying into America, literally, from South America. And, of course, a lot of that used to target black communities, right?
Yes, definitely. And so I have a CIA whistleblower, talking about how that came to be, plus a DEA whistleblower, Drug Enforcement Agency whistleblower named Mike Levine, who talked about this, about the way the CIA was trafficking that cocaine with the help of Nazis that were given safe haven from World War II, who were helping set up the cocaine trafficking routes from all these different Latin American countries, with the estimates of, there was an estimated 10,000 to 50,000 Nazis that were given safe haven in the Latin American countries. And they organized what they called cocaine coups in places like Bolivia and Argentina and other countries, and then set up these cocaine trafficking routes with the CIA to get the cocaine in the United States. And so Gary Webb wrote an article for the San Jose Mercury News that became one of the first what we call viral articles in the U.S. in the mid-1990s. But so that was huge. Crack was huge in the U.S., and it was being dealt by a lot of the black gangs across the U.S. But of course, it was kind of a CIA network that was first set up to get it to the black gangs. And so Tupac was actually working with his Black Panther extended family once he became a rapper and left his activist leadership of the New African Panthers. His Black Panther extended family were getting the Bloods and Crips, the largest gangs in the U.S., to call peace truces. They were normally warring for drug turf, but now they were calling peace truces and turning on to activism, and a lot of them were stopping the dealing of drugs. And that peace truce and turn on to activism spread throughout California with Tupac's help, and then spread throughout the United States. So that took huge amounts of money out of the CIA traffickers' coffers, and also took huge amounts of money, even larger amounts of money, out of the banks that were laundering that money.
See, this is where people really need to open their eyes, because this is where the money gets made. And I was seeing today in your documentary, we're talking somewhere between 500 billion up to $1 trillion in annual money for the drug trade. So when people come along, say Tupac or somebody else, and they're talking about maybe unifying the gangs and putting an end to this kind of thing, that puts a target on your back. And then, of course, we're fed all of these kind of crazier conspiracies that Tupac's still alive on an island and this one done it, that one done it. But I think we're getting very close to the truth here, because you start hitting the CIA in the pocket and you become a problem.
Yeah. And so I have in my film a high-level white police whistleblower named Russell Poole, who stumbled upon this information, basically that his fellow police officers, dozens of his fellow police officers, were at all levels of Tupac's last record label, Death Row Records. And he asked his superiors what they were doing there, and they told him you can call them covert agents. And so he found that, and then other police officers working with him found that these officers were involved in Death Row in general is involved in drug trafficking and gun running, and trying to stop the Bloods versus Crips peace truces that were spreading. And they also, of course, were involved in aiding U.S. intelligence in orchestrating Tupac's murder.
And of course, we had Tupac on the West Coast, I believe. We had Biggie Smalls out on the East Coast. And of course, two of them, they both met untimely demises, right?
Yeah, and so they tried to pretend like it was just an East Coast versus West Coast rap feud, which, is kind of irrational, doesn't even make sense. But they had done the same thing to the Black Panthers, pretending like there was an East Coast versus West Coast Black Panther feud between Tupac's mom, Afeni Shakur, when she was heading the Harlem Black Panthers, and Huey Newton when he was heading the National Black Panther office in Oakland. And so they used some of the same tactics. And but basically, the real culprit of these murders usually was U.S. intelligence. All the best evidence points to them.
Absolutely. And of course, I'm speaking to John Potash here. You can find his website at johnpotash.com. You can also check out the book, the documentary that goes by the name of Drugs as Weapons Against Us. And I'm really enjoying this tonight. We've got John for one more segment and a little bit more after that. So I'm going to try and cram as much in as I can. Our number 2 on today's Kev Baker Show, and our very special, amazing guest that's brought us all this information and a lot more to come, is John Potash. Now, please visit his website at johnpotash.com. That's JOHNPOTASH.com. Please visit that. And before the break, we were getting into Tupac. And of course, John himself has wrote a book on this previously. It's called The FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders. So if you want to know even more about all of that, I urge you to check that book out. And because we've only got John here for a couple of hours, it's really fast-paced. And I imagine, John probably feels like he's done about 10 rounds already with somebody that he might be suspecting is a CIA interrogator, the way I'm firing these questions at him. So, John, I hope you're enjoying your time on the show, because that's why I always make sure that the guest has a good time first and foremost. So I've not been too bad with you, have I?
No, not at all. It's been great, Kev. Thank you.
Awesome stuff. Now then, let's shift gears again, because somebody else that I really enjoyed listening to when I was growing up was Kurt Cobain. Now, he obviously has a very interesting story, and again, met a very untimely death. So talk to us about your research on Kurt Cobain.
Well, Kurt Cobain, was often called the John Lennon of his generation. And what I show about Kurt Cobain is the fact that he was very left-wing, anti-war, anti-racist, and doing good work on the side. But when he started, when he was first playing music, he also had this massive stomach problem. And so in the, I show a quote, I have John Stockwell, a CIA whistleblower in the film, saying that the CIA was bringing heroin now from Afghanistan in vast supplies in the late 80s and early 90s into the United States. And so the interview I show of Stockwell's was from about 1989. And so I show the evidence that to make demand match supply for the heroin, they had to really try to find another musician that could help promote the heroin. And so, they'd gotten John Lennon to use heroin and inadvertently promote it before he got off of it. They pretended like Hendrix was a heroin addict, and other musicians. But here it is, around 1990, and Kurt Cobain, I argue that they psychologically profiled a number of these musicians and found that Cobain, because of his massive stomach problem, he said in his diaries he tried heroin about 4 or 5 times in 4 years, from 1986 to 1990 or 91. And then he produced the album Nevermind with his incredible band Nirvana. And Nevermind, it was instantly shooting up the sales charts. And while it was shooting up the sales charts in about early 1991, into his life comes Courtney Love. Courtney Love's dating Billy Corgan, the lead singer from Smashing Pumpkins. She's at a party, and she leaves Corgan and immediately latches on to Kurt Cobain. They start dating, and within a month, 2 or 3 of them dating, she's pregnant with his child. And he does the right thing in terms of saying he's going to marry her, but she has to sign a prenuptial agreement because he didn't totally trust her. But all the people in Seattle that knew them, that was friends with Kurt and knew them, said that this was the first time when he was dating Courtney Love that he started using heroin daily, that she did that to manipulate Cobain, and she was very conniving and manipulative that way. And so then so I show the evidence that, he developed a heroin habit. He inadvertently was promoting heroin, which U.S. intelligence wanted. But then a year before his death, he actually found a cure to his stomach problem. And he said he was, sober at that point. He found that cure to his stomach problem. He got away from the heroin. And there was a blood test done in Rome a month before he died that showed he had no illicit substances, no illegal substances in his system. So not only was he not using heroin at that time, because you have to use it daily, because you develop a physiological dependence on it, but he also wasn't even smoking weed at that time, marijuana at that time. So, and they pretended like he was a regular heroin addict, in the last few months of his life. So then, of course, he ends up dying, and in the autopsy finds that he has enough heroin that would have killed at least 6 people, and 3 severe heroin addicts would have died from an overdose of the amount of heroin he had in his system when he died, Kurt Cobain. But he was also, of course, shot in the head with a shotgun. So I show the former president of the American Academy of Forensic Science, Cyril Wecht, on film saying for a news channel that he believes that Kurt Cobain was murdered and it was made to look like a suicide. And so all the best evidence shows that that is what really happened. And that Courtney Love actually aided U.S. intelligence in murdering Kurt Cobain because he was threatening at that point to promote sobriety and to promote leftist activism.
And we can't be having that. And I find it very interesting, as somebody that comes from a city that is blighted by heroin addiction here in Glasgow, Scotland. I think we had the really unfortunate title or tagline as the heroin capital of Europe at one stage. Now, you were saying that these users, it's daily. Absolutely. In fact, when it gets to the really bad stages, you're probably talking about hourly, every couple of hours. So the fact that somebody passed a test to say that they were absolutely clean, that's really, really important. And then to watch what happened maybe a month or so later with this very questionable death indeed, because I'm going to bring in my co-host now, John. He joined us there just after the break. Johnny Whistles is with us. Now, John, you've been listening to some of this here, and of course, you've lived in Glasgow, born and bred all your life. We've seen what heroin can do to people, John, and when they're gouging out Mr. Whistles, picking up a shotgun isn't exactly the first thing that I would say they're capable of doing. But what say you, Johnny Whistles?
No, definitely, Kev. It really was, I think it was a tragedy, really, for Kurt Cobain, because he was an absolute legend, and some of his lyrics, I think, that influenced a lot of people. But him, actually, Courtney Love, hearing that she may be involved in his death, it's absolutely shocking. That is really, it's honestly, that you can't fathom, do you know what I mean? But that's a woman that he was married and had a child to. My God, I'm not married, but you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think in the documentary, John, you've got a segment where Courtney Love's father is speaking, right?
Sure. Yeah, so I interviewed Courtney Love's father for an hour or two because he had finished a manuscript for his book, which he sent me in advance before he put it out. In that book, he says that when he was in Dublin doing research for a book in the 1980s, early 1980s or so, Courtney Love was 16, just turned 17 when she visited him there. And he inadvertently introduced her to a guy who had just befriended him in Dublin, a guy named Stephen O'Leary. Stephen O'Leary then takes Courtney under his wing and travels with Courtney for 6 weeks to London, where Courtney brings 1,000 hits of LSD and starts spreading it around like candy to all the musicians. She ends up sleeping with a lot of musicians too, ends up almost breaking up the Pogues. She slept with the drummer, and she, people from a lot of different bands just complained about how she was ruining the whole music scene with the things she was doing with, Adam Ant and different other musicians there. And so she proceeded. Now, so that was copying what Robert Lashbrook and a number of other agents did in London in 1965. And Courtney Love proceeds to do the same thing. She goes over to the Portland music scene and does the same thing, is passing drugs around like candy. Then goes to the Los Angeles music scene and does that. And then she marries the top punk musician in Los Angeles, a guy named James Moreland, who says that he thought he was marrying a punk feminist, and when he found out he was marrying like a right-wing Phyllis Diller, because she would say that she slept with army generals in Alaska who told us the wars are all good for us, and so she knew what was up and he didn't. And so and when he betrayed her, she would come in, she would get mafia thugs to come in and beat him up to make him do what she wanted. And so she actually, her biography, which I show in the film, shows that in my book I get into more detail. So in my book I talk about the fact that at about 4 or 5 years old, when she was about 4 or 5 years old, she was already going to counseling regularly. Her mother ordered her to counseling, and her mother had her see psychiatrists and get medication. And so, and then when she was about 5 or 6 years old, her mother's very wealthy parents paid off the lawyer for Hank Harrison, Courtney Love's biological father, to win custody over Courtney Love, so that Hank Harrison couldn't see her again for many years, and he went into deep depression over that, he said. And then when by the time Courtney Love was 13, she was in a juvenile delinquent facility and had written a letter to Hank Harrison to get her out of there. And so he helped get her out of there, and he found that she had turned into like a monster, he said, because she was a heroin addict, leaving syringes all over his home. She was prostituting. The leading biographies on Courtney Love said she was prostituting first for the Japanese mafia, which she was stripping for the Japanese mafia, but she said she was involved in live sex acts on stage. And then she was stripping for the Taiwanese mafia in Taiwan. And she, according to Courtney Love's own letters that one biographer, award-winning writer, wrote, Melissa Rossi, said that she admitted prostituting when she was in her teens. And then Hank Harrison said when she visited him in Dublin, she was hooking on the streets of Dublin. So she was already a prostitute and a heroin addict that was very easy to manipulate and or use by the CIA to do their bidding thereafter.
And what's quite interesting in what you said there was the fact that she was exposed to the psychiatric industry at a very early age, and we can see how instrumental and how big a part they played in the whole MK Ultra programs as well.
Yes, and she listed all the psychohypnotic drugs her counselors were giving her, psychiatrists were giving her at a very early age, and those were all MK Ultra drugs. So I show them in my book and in my film too. But actually, in my book, I get into more detail about Love, but in the film, I pretty much stick with her early teen years onwards.
I mean, she sounds like somebody that could definitely have been used as, let's say, an asset by the CIA, an infiltrator, and the way she worked her way around the music industry that we're hearing here certainly feels that way.
Sure, and you guys have a great documentary filmmaker named Nick Broomfield, who did the movie Kurt and Courtney, and caught and had Eldon Hoke on film saying that Courtney Love offered him $50,000 to blow Kurt Cobain's head off. And he said, he didn't take the money, but he knows who did. And he started to name the person that did take the money. Within 3 days of Nick Broomfield filming him, he died. And he died in the presence of that person he started to name, and a guy named Alan Wrench. So it's really, really incredible how much evidence actually is out there that Courtney Love aided a very powerful group in the murder of Kurt Cobain. And the best evidence that I show in my book and film is that was a U.S. intelligence.
Absolutely. Now, we've obviously got a whole host of music stars, rap artists that are influencing generations today. Any that you've come across that really raised some red flags for you? How about Eminem, people like that? Anyone that jumps out?
Yeah, so I talk a lot more about Eminem in my book, and I'll have him in the bonus scenes that are coming out now, actually, of the film, where Eminem, I argue, was manipulated to promote ecstasy. Now they call it was originally called MDMA. It was an MK Ultra drug. They turned, they also call it ecstasy, and now they call it Molly on the streets of the United States. I don't know if they have the same nickname in the UK. But ecstasy is found by many international studies to cause memory problems. And with not that many hits, it's causing memory problems. And so it's a really dangerous drug. And so I show how a high-level mafia ecstasy dealer in New York was hired by the DEA and FBI, and they paid him to become an undercover agent to infiltrate Wu-Tang Clan, a popular rap group here. And he became the personal manager for 2 members of Wu-Tang Clan. And then the Village Voice came out with an expose about this Michael Caruso, who was this undercover, personal manager for these two rappers in Wu-Tang Clan, and said he was being paid by the FBI and the DEA, and he was an ecstasy kingpin. And what was he doing inside Wu-Tang Clan? And so Wu-Tang Clan instantly fired him, of course, but not before he had promoted ecstasy like crazy through the one of the most popular rap groups in the country. And with a load of parties and all that, and handing out ecstasy like crazy at all these parties around New York City. So I show how now in South Africa, the head of chemical warfare, a guy named Wouter Basson, was found through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened after apartheid fell in South Africa. This guy was found to, his assistant said he was directed to manufacture a ton of ecstasy by Wouter Basson. And Basson was actually caught dealing the ecstasy in black neighborhoods. And so I have Basson on film saying that he was also, involved with Porton Down of England and Fort Detrick in the United States, which are the 2 chemical warfare, headquarters in England and the United States, and that chemical warfare is the use of drugs as unconventional warfare.
Ah, yes, Porton Down. That came up in our research in our shows quite recently because we had this whole debacle of the Russian spy that was poisoned. How conveniently, only 3 miles from Porton Down, the one place in the UK that does store Novichok nerve agent. Just a coincidence, of course, John.
Yeah, right.
And I obviously wasn't around at the time of Woodstock and the LSD and tune in and drop out, all that stuff, but I was around in the 90s. And I must admit, when I was going clubbing in England in the early 90s, mid-90s, ecstasy, it was being given away like sweeties. And
Yeah.
I spoke to Mark Devlin, who has a couple of books called Musical Truth 1 and 2, and he contests, and I think I have to agree with him, that, for what the LSD was used for back in the 70s, ecstasy and acid house and rap music and everything that goes with it was definitely a similar period in time in the 90s and noughties. Wouldn't you agree?
Definitely, yes. Yeah, I think I'm about your same age, Kev. And I remember going to these raves in the United States, and ecstasy was, flowing all over the place. Acid was so popular over there at those acid house parties and rave parties. And yes, I agree. They were the drugs. It was the new MK Ultra, I believe. And I actually, when I was counseling people, they said I was counseling some guys who were dealing ecstasy and acid at at different raves around Baltimore. And one of them, I asked him about what my theory was about the government being behind it, and he said he was going to talk to his friend whose whole family was mafia. And when he talked to his friend said, "You don't want to be asking questions like that." And his friend was trembling as he was telling him that, because he was scared to death that he was, implying that this could be the case. And, of course, it was coming from me. And when he came back to me and told me this, he said, "You better watch yourself. This is very dangerous." My friend was scared to death that I even asked that question.
You see, this is very dangerous because you're talking about mafia that are involved at the kind of street level of this big industry, because that's what it is. Make no mistake, folks, this is an industry, one of the most profitable industries in the world as well. And that's why it is dangerous. I often say, some truths bring you great heat. And I imagine this kind of stuff here, because of the people you're dealing with and the people you might be hurting in the pocket, It's absolutely one of these topics. Now, kind of off topic, maybe, but not so much. We see a great push now, and I'm encouraged by it, but medical marijuana, recreational marijuana, and the fact that the pharmaceutical companies are getting involved in that. Is there something untoward going on here in John's speculation?
Well, I'm fine with medical marijuana as long as, it's used for medical purposes, and I'm fine with decriminalization of marijuana. The only thing is that I counsel so many people that say in their young teens, it's really causing them to get more apathetic. It's hurting their grades. It's causing them some to drop out of school, some just to get worse grades in school, but make it harder to get into college. And for a lot of young people, especially poor young people, life becomes a lot harder when you really have a harder time getting into college because of poor grades, because you're smoking weed all the time. So that's the problem with the whole movement to say marijuana is good for medical reasons. Now, sure, it's good for some things medically, and that's great. But when people think it's good for everything medically and it's so incredibly healthy, that's another story, because it's basically, I almost failed at high school. Didn't graduate from high school because I was smoking weed daily my senior year of high school. And when I weaned off of all these drugs in college, I went from, almost failing one class to getting, A's and B's, to grad school when I got off of everything and was completely sober, I got straight A's. And so it's generally the way it works with drugs, even weed. I'm fine with people smoking weed recreationally as long as they, I just hope they don't smoke every day. And if they do, I hope they realize that it could be causing some problems,
Absolutely. And let me bring Johnny back in here, because I'm sure Johnny is absolutely full of questions for you, John. Johnny's a bit of a musician himself, and we've often talked about Laurel Canyon, so we might backtrack here because John missed the first hour. But John, we've been talking about Lennon, we've been talking about Tupac Shakur, Laurel Canyon. Is there anything you want to put to John Potash, Johnny?
Yeah, John, it's actually Sam Cooke. Yeah, remember he was shot in the hotel. Well, so it said he was shot, but one of the women, Etta James, she saw his body, and she said, and she maintained that his injuries were more consistent with being beaten to death rather than a shooting. Do you know anything about that one?
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure I mentioned Sam Cooke in Drugs as Weapons Against Us, and have maybe a sentence or two about him, but I have more in the FBI world on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders, and even more in the end notes of the FBI world on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders about the case of Sam Cooke, because the best evidence and all the details suggest that the mafia and/or U.S. intelligence connections with the mafia murdered Sam Cooke because he was one of the first black musicians not only was he an incredible black musician, but he was the first one to get control of his masters and start controlling his own business with his master recordings. And
that's what I thought, because I always thought that people were more jealous of Sam Cooke with just how successful he was, rather than try and kill him for a nefarious reason.
Yeah, no, I think it was more nefarious just because he fits the pattern of any of these artists that tried to get more independent of the mafia and U.S. intelligence control. Had fatal outcomes, sadly enough.
Of course, now there's something also which we refer to loosely as the 27 Club, and that's all these stars that meet untimely deaths at the age of 27. I don't know if you've looked into that at any depth, John, but what's your take on that?
Well, I don't actually talk about it directly in my books, but I do talk about Janis Joplin. Her fiance at one time had admitted to another girlfriend he was former FBI, showed the evidence that he really was involved in U.S. intelligence, and she of course cut it off with him when she found he had a family, wife and kids in another state. But he had gotten her hooked on amphetamines. She died at 27. Brian Jones was 27. And in the bonus scenes of my film, I show the way, all the evidence that Brian Jones was drowned in his own swimming pool and the tour manager for the Rolling Stones had a guy on his deathbed admit that he helped drown and kill Brian Jones, murder Brian Jones. And he was 27, of course. Kurt Cobain was 27. Jimi Hendrix was 27. A number of these musicians were 27. So I show how they, U.S. intelligence, and I'm sure British intelligence has used what they call anniversary timing tactics. For example, with Martin Luther King, the exact to the day anniversary of Martin Luther King announcing his opposition to the Vietnam War, he was assassinated. And I show other instances like that of assassinations on the exact year anniversaries of big time events, and I show that that's a subconscious psychological tactic to put in people's minds. Not even, it doesn't even have to be consciously; it can be subconsciously, that if you do this, you're gonna die. And I argue that that could be one of the reasons for killing a number of these activist musicians at 27.
Absolutely. And Johnny Whistles, you want in here quickly before the break?
Yeah, John, I mean, this is actually quite a dangerous job that you're doing. So do you ever get any backlash at all?
Yeah, I mean, I've had my mail mess with, I've had my email mess with, I've had my phone mess with, I've had a number of things, a lot of backlash that way, but that's some of it. I don't even know how much is going on that I don't, that I can't even keep track of, but there's been a number of incidents over the years, yes.
Does not surprise me at all, sir, and that shows you're getting close to the truth. John Potash is with us for 10 more minutes. Don't go anywhere.
This is the Kev Baker Show.
John Potash is here with me for another 10 minutes on the Kev Baker Show. So if you have any questions, please head on over to tfrlive.com/chat. Please type question in big caps so it jumps out at me so I don't have to go scrolling for them. And we're going to really interrogate John for the final 10 minutes that he's been here. But I'm pleased to tell everyone he's had a good time. And that's what it's all about here on the Kev Baker Show. Highly informative today, and also kind of light as well. And I say light because this is the kind of show that you can take to family members and friends. They won't start rolling their eyes and thinking you're some tinfoil conspiracy theorist. In fact, on the contrary, I think it might lead them to the fact and the realization that there's a lot more going on in the world than meets the eye. And music, on the face of it, should just be pure entertainment, something we can sit back to, enjoy, relax to. But we can see, John, how it has literally been weaponized from the 50s, 60s onwards.
Yeah, sadly enough. And it's just too bad that some of our favorite artists that I talk about in this movie are not with us anymore to hear more of their great music.
And I've got a question from the chat room, and this is from Cypherdine Syndromes. I like that. It says, do you think there could be a new wave of weaponized designer drugs on the horizon, given that Generation Z is so different from any of the other generations before? And would a very different type of drug, ? Would it be a different type of drug? Now, I was asking you during one of the breaks, you know, we see a lot of talk about DMT, ayahuasca, stuff like that. And personally, I think this is really kind of great. It helps to explore different dimensions, different aspects of your mind, of reality. But what say you? Do you think we could be looking at maybe the LSD of the 60s now being substituted with something like ayahuasca or DMT? And obviously, John, this is speculation on both our parts.
Yeah, I mean, it surely could be. I just don't know. I've heard of ayahuasca as a psychedelic, but I don't know a whole lot about it. DMT, I actually tried when I was in high school, though I think I did it the wrong way, so it was neutralized. But these are terrible. There are all different kinds of psychedelics, just other versions of psychedelics. But there's all kinds of new drugs out there these days. Ketamine, they call Special K in the rave world. And there's bath salts, there's spicing K2, the supposedly synthetic marijuana. which actually the chemical makeup of them are changing all the time to avoid being detected in drug tests. And so they're not really synthetic marijuana. They're just synthetic drugs that might try to mimic marijuana, but with the chemical makeup changing all the time, you don't know what you're putting in your brain when you smoke it. And so, yes, there's a lot of different drugs out there these days that are hurting people's minds. And the bath salts, became popular in the United States for a little while.
I remember that. I remember seeing videos of people running about naked. And over here recently in the UK, this was something I heard about maybe a couple of years ago, but crocodile. This is another one that's really literally eating people alive. So, I mean, some of the drugs that are out there right now, it's mind-boggling, pardon the pun.
Yeah, no, you're right. It is incredible how many drugs are out there, and surely an extension of MK Ultra, because that's what they were doing. They kept testing new drugs to be used and tried to hurt young idealistic people's minds.
Absolutely, and of course the MK Ultra programs of the day, they may well be in the past. However, they're going to be under different guises, different names now. And I think it would be naive for anyone to think that the CIA, MI6, all of these agencies have all of a sudden just stopped all of their influence in using drugs, that they're not going to do that anymore. So I think we've always got to be on our toes and looking at the bigger picture when it comes to music, new trends, the drugs that go with them. I think we really have to pay attention to that, wouldn't you say?
Yes, sure. And just I hope people can take our work as a warning to not go with these trends and just to be independent thinkers and not think that sex, drugs, and rock and roll is normal, but it's but realize that it could be manufactured and by U.S. intelligence.
I think we should call it
sex and the rock and roll without the drugs.
I think we should really call it CIA sex, drugs, and rock and roll with all the information we're getting into here. And one last quick question before I let you go, John. During your studies, did you come across any kind of satanic element to all of this in the music and the drugs, anything like that? Laurel Canyon, anything at all jump out at you?
Yeah, I did find out about the satanic rituals that were part of cults like the Process Church. And the Process Church was national, and Manson was linked to the Process Church. One of the top leaders of the Process Church visited Manson when he was in prison. And so Process Church was found to, when it was analyzed by a trauma specialist, a psychologist who lectured nationally and was a trauma specialist. He said that he had talked to a number of trauma specialists who dealt with, kids that were sexually and physically abused early on from between the ages of 3 and 8. And he says that when they also studied MK Ultra and the particular sub-project that was involved in causing this kind of, damage, sexual and physical abuse that can cause dissociative disorder, formerly dissociative identity disorder, I should say, which is formerly known as multiple personality disorder. This Process Church used the exact same techniques in the exact same stages as MK Ultra, and says it could not, and did it in many parts of the country, showing that it could not have been a coincidence. It must have been an extension of U.S. intelligence's, MK Ultra work, and that so what these Process Church satanic ritual type cults was just front groups really for U.S. intelligence work.
Absolutely. And John, I'm not going to take up any more of your time today because hopefully I'll be able to bring you back on in the future with another installment of the CIA, sex, drugs, rock and roll, Laurel Canyon and everything that goes along with it. And again, I can't thank you enough for your time today, but more importantly, the piece of work that you've put together here, both the book and the documentary. I'm certainly going to be rushing off to get the book because you always find there's more in the book. You can get into greater detail there. So again, sir, thank you for putting all of this together and really been very informative here on the show today. I can't thank you enough.
You're very welcome, Kev. Thanks so much for having me on.
And of course, folks, remember, check out John's work over at johnpotash.com. That's JOHNPOTASH.com. Waste no time. Head on over there. You can watch the DVD, the documentary, various ways to watch it. So I urge you all, please check that out. So John, I will let you go. Get back about your day now. You can probably go and have a breather after this interrogation, man.
I got to run to do some counseling now at my private office. But thanks, Kev. I appreciate it. It's great talking to you.
And
Take
the
care now.
counseling work, absolutely, again, amazing stuff, because you're obviously helping a lot of people on a lot of different levels here. And that kind of work, priceless.
Thanks.
Thank
Take care,
you,
Kev.
sir. I'll let you go now.